Hi, everyone. So I think we'll get started now with the panel discussion. So if you could please turn your attention back up here. My name is Paul Nicknish. I'm a grad student here at MIT in the Earth, Atmosphere and Planetary Science Department. I work on climate science, and I'm thrilled to be up here with three amazing panelists who all work on climate change and climate policy here in Massachusetts. So the way this will work is I'll give a quick introduction of our panelists and then get the conversation started. And then after that point, we'll open it up to audience questions. Feel free to ask anything that might be on your mind. And the only thing we ask that is if you do have a question, please raise your hand, and then we'll bring a mic to you so that everyone can hear the question. All right, so to get started, we have Callie Benavides, who is a senior analyst at the National Grid, where she leads strategy and development for for energy efficiency programs serving commercial and industrial customers. Her work focuses on designing practical solutions that reduce energy use and emissions while supporting broader climate and system planning goals. And she brings a decade of experience in the energy sector. She has previous positions at the US Department of Energy, Charles Rivers Associates, and Chevron. And in addition to her industry experiences, she has had a variety of academic research experience as well, working on industrial decarbonization, particularly in hard to decarbonize industries such as steel. And she has also done work on hydrogen and carbon capture. Next to Callie, we have Dr. Jane Smyth, who is a climate scientist on the Responsible Investment Research Team at the Man Group, where she works on problems related to climate risk, adaptation, and decarbonization. She earned her PhD in atmospheric and oceanic sciences from Princeton, working on monsoon variability. And more recently, she completed postdoctoral work here at MIT, working on extreme precipitation. And then finally, we have Dr. Jeremy Gregory, who is the executive director of the MIT Climate and Sustainability Consortium. And he has extensive experience working with industry partners and diverse stakeholders across MIT. In his research, he studies economic and environmental implications of engineering and system design choices, particularly in the areas of materials productions and recovery systems. And research topics for Dr. Gregory include product and firm environmental footprinting, manufacturing and life cycle cost analysis, and the characterization of sustainable materials. So thank you all for being here. And to get the conversation started, I would like to ask the question. So it's often, if you spend too much time reading about climate change and all this issues surrounding climate change in the media, it's very easy for people to become disheartened with how overwhelming the problem is. So what I'd like to ask is, based on your extensive experience in these different areas, what do you think are some of the key areas in which we can most rapidly make progress with regards to anything associated with climate change and the challenges it poses? Whoever would like to start first, go for it.
Go ahead, Callie.
Okay. Yeah, I think one thing that kind of counterbalances maybe the disheartening feeling is looking back just kind of 10, 20, 30 years that at the progress that we have had. I think, it's at least worthwhile to give ourselves credit for that. I know folks talk a lot about solar. Oh, now solar, the cost parity is kind of there. And I mean, if you look at the build out of renewables, it's like, wow, that wasn't the case when you look back to the early 90s or things like that. So I think there has been progress. And I think that's something to give hope. I think also kind of looking back at other environmental issues that were huge problems or things that we did in the past that you're like, oh, we would never do that now. Now we have regulations in place and companies are operating in different ways. So it's kind of progress is happening, I think.
Yeah, I guess I've found it really heartening in my work to see how many people at large institutions around the world take climate change very, very seriously. And it's sort of at the forefront of their minds when they're allocating their money and making investment decisions. So for a little context, I work at an investment management company called Man Group. It's based in London. And we have clients from all over the world. It's mostly institutional investors, so think pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, people with very long investment horizons. And once you kind of are outside the bubble of the US and our internal drama over climate change, you realize that actually the rest of the world is taking this very seriously, and I found that very encouraging. people are really trying to wrap their heads around what, physical risks and all the science of climate change means for financial decision making and the economy as a whole.
Well, I lead this Climate and Sustainability Consortium here at MIT, and it's a group of 15 companies from a variety of different sectors. They're pretty big companies like Amazon, Apple, Cargill, Dow, IBM, PepsiCo, Verizon. And the thing that's really heartening for me is just like how committed they are to reducing their environmental impacts and the ways in which they think strategically about it, how their investments not only decarbonize their own operations, but then also act as a catalyst for other sectors. And so kind of like as Jane said, we can sometimes get wrapped up in the politics of what's happening here in this country. They operate all over the world and have made these climate commitments, and they're still sticking to them and really taking action. So at least for me, seeing actions that happen there and then also at the state and municipal levels still really gives me hope that there's still a lot of activities that are happening related to decarbonization.
Nice. So yeah, I guess at this point, if people in the audience have questions they'd like to ask, feel free. Otherwise, I can ask questions as well. But if there's anything on your minds that you'd like to ask, go for it. I guess another, as people are thinking of things, another thing that, on the flip side of that, like, what do you still see as sort of the remaining challenges or largest obstacles in terms of addressing climate change or issues related to climate policy based on your various experiences?
I guess everything else.
Yeah.
I would say, a big barrier, at least for the companies, is still cost. I think that, a few years ago when there's a lot more momentum behind climate, they could kind of get away with, companies are always thinking about costs and profit, but they could maybe get away a little bit more on, investments related to climate. That maybe were a bit more expensive than they were originally comfortable with, whereas now there's way more scrutiny on that. A lot of them are basically framing their decarbonization decisions in terms of cost per ton of CO2 abated. And so whatever that metric was they had before, maybe they used to be willing to have that be a little bit higher number. Now they're maybe thinking more lower numbers. But so I'd say that's like, and there are some investments that they can't do on their own, around carbon capture or just infrastructure for electric vehicles. And so that cost and sort of pooling resources is a big challenge. And that's often where we get involved in research to kind of help them with one or both of those things.
Yeah. I would say one issue that comes up, there are a lot of challenges. I could speak to, scientific data. I could speak to like negotiating, thinking on various time horizons. That's another challenge, balancing, short-term liabilities, the need to pay pensioners out regularly, and the need to be sustainable in a long-term way. But I think another thing that's sort of a big picture challenge is a lot of these investors, their portfolios are more exposed to developed markets. And so they're not some of the places where climate impacts are greatest are kind of underrepresented in their investment scope, right? So you can definitely manage the risks that you're exposed to, but there's not a clear signal through these analyses to like address, some of the most exposed geographies. So there's a lot of challenges.
Yeah, no, that makes sense. I guess.
Yeah, I was thinking kind of like a lot of the things that maybe were, easier, but the more cost-effective options are things that kind of, companies would do first. And then kind of as you project out, like, okay, if we want to get to like 100% net zero, like that last bit is very difficult to, eventually all those sectors that we called like hard to decarbonize or hard to abate, like you'll have to move into those and the expense and kind of everything like that. how much can people afford? You know, people have to pay their energy bill, so it's kind of balancing that, like, what pace can we really move at?
Gotcha. Yeah.
It's coming.
Hello. I guess my question is that right now the temperature rises from but given what is already in the air, whether we could talk about mostly US-based organizations and we have a little bit broader, but not including the non-developed countries basically, and national grid is very well. I wonder what is the, over 5 years, what is your pick-in range? Because you know that it will be higher than 1.1. 1.5 even achievable. Are you already looking at beyond 1.5? And how do you look at the risk of that? Thank you.
Well, on the like kind of technical aspects around temperature rises, that this CS3 is way better capable to answer that than I am. But I would say the companies that we work with, they're thinking a lot about resilience and adaptation. You know, so they are both, you know, trying to do their best with science-based targets to, you know, meet net zero targets by a certain year, while also acknowledging that you know, decisions they make around their supply chains and not even like decarbonization issues, but also water availability, they're all framed by climate change. And so I think there's very much you know, planning mindset, like, you know, around a variety of different scenarios, including ones where we don't limit the warning to you know, only 1.5 degrees.
Yeah, I would echo that. We've also seen a huge emergence of this climate adaptation and resilience theme. So investors are interested in, like, okay, which companies are going to be...
Okay.
Oh, can you not hear us now? Can you hear?
Yeah. He's got to turn it on, I think,
okay.
but yeah. Go ahead. Yeah.
Can you guys hear anything?
Is that better?
Is this better?
Okay.
Hello?
Okay.
Okay. What was I saying?
Climate adaptation and resilience.
Yeah,
there you go.
so investors are looking at the companies that are providing adaptation solutions that will be supporting resilience and investing in those companies, for example. And there was something else you said. Oh, I'll come back if you. Oh yeah, so people also conduct in the investment space scenario analysis and look at, you know, what risks emerge at different levels of warming. But personally, like, I tend to emphasize, okay, the differences between these scenarios are going to emerge in the future. For now, let's focus on the more robust effects that are more well understood and supported by the literature, like increasing precipitation extremes or, you know, heat, so that we don't overemphasize, you know, these uncertain future conditions. We can, yeah.
Yeah, and I guess like a more local level is kind of seeing, we can kind of see the reaction at the city and state level, all of the kind of 2030 goals, which is only 4 years away.
Yeah.
So I think now people are really being forced to reckon with. I think when they made those goals, they were very ambitious. And now, you know, are they going to hold themselves to meeting that? Is it realistic? I think, like we talked about before, like balancing everything else. Is it worth trying to meet those goals with everything else and kind of the side effects? And then how do you look forward to 2050? I mean, I think it seems more worthwhile to make realistic goals than to make these ones that we're setting ourselves up that we can't achieve.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's kind of cool to hear you talk about these companies focusing on their kind of internal resilience building, because from my perspective, we also try and, you know, get a sense of that to say, okay, so we're better off investing in companies that have less exposure to physical hazards or less threats like to their resources that they depend on, like water, if they have really high water use in their operations and they're in water stress locations or something, their facilities. And we also try and scan their, company statements, financial documents for evidence that they are making plans to deal with natural hazards or, building resilience and backup plans to say, okay, these companies, are the ones to invest in more because they're ahead of that problem.
I think there's a question back here.
I'm curious about the infrastructure and physical assets that companies work with. What are some typical, time scales that those physical assets degrade over? For example, you have large, electrical generation plants or transmission lines. How do companies make the decisions about when it's time to transition to something else versus continue to maintain what they have?
Do you want to talk about energy infrastructure? You should go.
Yeah, I mean, typically when businesses are planning, there's like usually a lifetime of a facility it's like 20 to 30 years, but that's not necessarily that plant will shut down. It's just like in 20 and 30 years, there's probably some major capital investment that is going to have to go in, and that's usually like a decision point. So I think companies usually think more on that time scale, not like hundreds of years. I mean, some of the really older companies who have been around might take that strategy, but yeah, I think more on that time scale, which when you think of kind of planning ahead, yeah, it kind of locks you into certain decisions.
Yeah, I think what I was going to say is that there's a few different ways to think about it. One is like, what is the lifetime of the actual asset, which in many cases is decades, but still there's still like a financial timeline that the companies are interested in, which is usually much shorter, and related to whether it's just something like depreciation or also, I think companies very rarely actually own their own assets, right? They're usually leasing them. One of our member companies is called Prologis, and they're like the largest industrial warehouse manufacturer in the world. And their whole business model is basically, constructing a warehouse or increasingly now a data center and then leasing it to a customer. So in their case, they are interested in the life cycle of that asset, but their customers, Amazon, Walmart, whatever, they're leasing it, and so their time horizon is definitely not the same thing as that whole asset. And I think that's what kind of, you would think, oh gosh, I'm going to build this building, I want it to be there for decades, and that kind of long-term life cycle thinking isn't always included in like kind of the financial decisions that they're making, which is tough. Yeah.
I think there's a question in the back there. Yeah.
Thank you. I was wondering, like, from your perspective, like how big of a harm the current U.S. administration is doing, like, for the fight against climate change, given like the withdrawal from many international organizations, and like if you have some views on, like, for example, are investors or companies still like for example somehow responding to this by like reducing interest for finding solutions, or because there's less regulatory pressure that would of course like impact. Yeah.
Great. I'll take a crack at that. I think that there's no question that the federal government's current stances are having an impact in a couple different ways. One is just like kind of sentiment. It's hard to get excited about climate change when you hear, mitigating the impacts of climate change when there's so much like kind of negative sentiment around it at the federal level. But another key thing, I mentioned like cost is a key barrier. We rely on the federal government to really help with incentives to get a lot of these industries, rolling, to get them started. But I, on the other hand, I would definitely say they're not the be-all and end-all, right? And we saw this the last time we had a Trump administration. They promised we're going to bring back coal, right? They were really strong supporters of that. They promised it, and it didn't happen just because it wasn't economically, feasible. And like we see that right now, renewables are cheaper than fossil fuels, and so even when you take away incentives, they're not accelerating at the same pace as they would with more incentives. It's still happening, and so I think, as I said, there's no question it's having an impact, but it's not halting efforts, right? You just have to become a bit more strategic about how you think about investments, maybe where you're doing them, and looking for partners outside of the federal government. Like I said, states, municipalities, or the private sector. And increasingly, we see our member companies saying, let's pool our resources together to start charging systems for electric trucking, as an example, right? Rather than rely on that to happen elsewhere. So it's not the be all and end all.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I think you guys both spoke to private companies who are continuing to take action, and you see it kind of in the news a lot. I mean, around data centers, which is maybe you don't want to get into that whole discussion, but I mean, these companies are voluntarily taking a lot of steps to source their own energy and continue to explore these different areas. So I think there's a lot of activity still happening. There's still solar development happening on the ground. And at the state level as well, I think things are, especially in Massachusetts, are still very active. I mean, National Grid that I work on, essentially, the energy efficiency program, like we are Mass Save. So if you've heard that name, that's still a very active program. So, yeah.
Hi, my name is Kat. Thank you for being here with the panel. So, Jane, I think what you said is really key in terms of the decoupling of the effects that are being experienced in the, let's say, underdeveloped markets compared to the massive impact that the developed markets are shaping. Yet it seems that in terms of systemic thinking, we do have so much thought leadership by lots of academic institutions. Do you see any of these systems level tools that are being used, and perhaps there's more momentum to that now with AI, perhaps, being used by investors or maybe on the corporation side? Are they looking at those effects? Because you can, of course, imagine the circularity of that with facilities being destroyed and Puerto Rico going back to resilience, but also the worsening health of the population, et cetera, et cetera.
So you're asking if you see the industry taking a sort of system level view of climate impacts.
It seems that there's got to be a tool that lets you plug in this and then evaluate the systems level impact of your technology 30, 50 years now. That sounds like a no.
Yeah, so I guess I think investors are trying to think of different ways of addressing the problem, but they're working within some constraints. Like, so, if we're an investment manager, we have a fiduciary duty to the clients to pursue returns, right? Because we're talking about the wealth of nations and of hardworking pensioners who need their retirement money to be handled with care and not to be pursuing, without a very explicit mandate, certain values, especially without rock solid proof that those decisions will lead to real world impacts that justify the trade-off with financial performance, right? So we're not really in the same position as policymakers or philanthropists, or there are opportunities within the investment space for a pure social impact, and that's very exciting, and there's a lot of innovation around new financial instruments that can both support resilience and provide returns, for example, certain catastrophe bonds that are developed by with help from the World Bank in different locations to provide insurance that is like very rapidly delivered after an event for a place that that isn't like traditionally insurable, things like that. So there's definitely innovation in this space and a lot of different research, but I'll say, like, at least from my position, there's some hard constraints around it. I don't know if that answers your question, but I'm just
I think
yeah.
for investors, the timeline is wrong. It's much shorter than that impact. But Jeremy, maybe you can comment on this. So if I'm Amazon, I'm probably still going to want to be here 50 years from now, right? As a company. So my timeline as a large company might be much longer than even somebody on the investment side. So how do I think about that as a corporation?
Yeah, I think tools. The best tools are ones that support specific decisions, and I would kind of put them in a few different categories in terms of like kind of at what level you're thinking about decisions. So I'd say at the highest level, I don't know if you've heard of the En-ROADS tool. So I think that's like, you're not really going to make decisions around a specific policy there, but it does show you, oh, if I pull this lever, it will have this impact on the climate, and so I think that's good. But they would say, people who make that, it's like an educational tool, right? Next level down, I would say still very much systems level, but kind of more detailed is like a lot of what the CS3 does, which is kind of like integrated climate and economic models, which are, if we put in this specific policy, what impact will that have on whatever climate or health metric that you're interested in? And they do that like at an economy or level, like for a country or for a globe. So very much a policymaker perspective, which in both of those are good. I'd say at the company level, the way they're thinking about it is they make a climate commitment, and that's often in the context of like you hear about science-based targets. That science-based target is in the context of these global climate models, but you have to figure out like sort of how much you allocate the burden of that particular company to the overall emissions. And so there are some ways you do that. But then when they do that commitment internally within the company, they have to figure out how much comes from different sectors. And so what we work a lot with our companies on are these things called marginal abatement cost curves. And that goes back to what I mentioned before, where they're figuring out what's the cost per CO2 abated. And so essentially to do that, you do a techno-economic analysis and a life cycle assessment of those specific technologies. But even that will be, I'd say, pretty high level. You're doing that on something like, what if we did wind power, or what if we use low carbon concrete? And so that's kind of, I'd say, technology level decisions. And then if that sort of passes that threshold, then they'll do project level decisions. So I don't know if that's like kind of how I think about like those different tools. But even within the techno-economic analysis, per your point, you choose a time horizon for that you're interested in. And so there's still very much, it depends on the perspective of the analyst or the decision maker in terms of what their priorities are. Yeah, sure.
And maybe one other tool I would mention is like a benefit cost analysis. Sometimes they'll look at kind of like a certain measure. So if in the energy efficiency space, they'll look at like, okay, over the lifetime of this measure, if you change out that light bulb, like how much energy will it save? And they can correlate that to like maybe any emission savings, any health benefits, and then we know the cost of the to install this new equipment, and so that's kind of a common ratio that companies will use.
I guess I do have one example of a systemic approach that we take, which is for like a certain decarbonization oriented fund, in order to decide which sectors and geographies to prioritize as far as allocating capital. We use for part of that like integrated assessment models actually, and looking at with a share of emissions coming from those different regions and sectors in order to prioritize where the decarbonization effort is highest. And then also on a more granular level, looking at like technology readiness levels from the IEA to say, okay, different technology readiness levels should be supported by different types of investment. So whether you're working in like, venture capital, or, you know, public equities. There's a, you know, if you're working, you know, it corresponds to a different technology readiness level that you can support with your money. So that's one approach. I would say.
And I know MIT supports a lot of private companies doing that, who want to do that type of modeling.
A question I had for you all, I was curious to hear your perspectives on, sorry, do you mind if I use the microphone?
Oh, yeah, sorry.
I was curious to hear your all perspectives on how the sort of advent of AI and the computing power that goes along with it fits into these various industries' sustainability and energy efficiency goals. Or if it's something that people are even thinking about at the firm level.
Yeah. I guess in kind of the utility energy space, it's more kind of how do we meet this new energy demand? Because historically, the electricity usage was kind of flat, and utilities kind of had their rate cases, and now kind of with the forecasts looking like a huge increase. I think that's a huge discussion around, okay, what do we build out? And then private companies are looking at kind of building out their own energy generation sources, which is unusual, you know, to bring back a nuclear power plant online to power a data center. I mean, I think that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, I'd say when it comes to meeting a company's net zero targets, you're sort of basically playing with two main levers. One is the quantity of an activity or a product, and then the other is the emissions intensity. So it's like, you know, kilograms or tons of CO2 per amount of material or amount of service or whatever, and then the amount of that service. So you have those two things you can play with. The tricky thing is a lot of companies don't want to decrease the amount that they're selling or the service that they're providing, so they really focus on that emissions intensity. But of course, if you have that activity increasing a lot, then it's really hard to have a commensurate amount of decrease in that emissions intensity. And that, to me, kind of represents the challenge of AI right now. All of our companies are thinking about that, but, you know, some more than others that are more particularly invested in it. Having said that, they also are looking at many different ways to use AI to solve sustainability challenges, and we have many examples of that happening here at MIT that I can talk about for a while. So there are two sides of that coin, but I think the kind of the burden side of it is more prevalent or in front of mind right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I saw a headline that was like Wyoming. It had a headline that there's a data center. They're going to be the biggest, 10 gigawatts. I was like, okay. So they're going to build a lot of gas plants for that.
Yeah. I think you got a question in the back too, right? Feel free, but I just didn't want to forget your hand there too. So.
My question is more on a micro level on like international governance of the climate change progress. Like previously there's like the Paris Agreement, UN, but now some may say like there's more like deglobalization happening and then nationalism. How do you see the governing structure respond to like these kind of trends? And how can is there any mechanism to ensure the climate responsibility are distributed more equitably across different countries, across different regions? Yeah.
I guess theoretically, yes. I know maybe it wasn't this last COP, but the COP before, where they talked about the fund that the developed countries were going to contribute to for resiliency measures for smaller countries or island nations that were more at risk. So I think theoretically, yes, but in reality, when companies have to cough up money or, you know, it's all kind of voluntary in a way, so politics.
Do you want to say?
I mean, it's definitely concerning, you know, having something handled equitably with degrading international institutions, it's going to be even harder than it already was. I don't have anything good to say on this.
Yeah, I feel like the headlines of the lately.
Yeah, I don't really. There's no question. It is the challenge of our time, and yet it's like, I think that part of the like a big part, we can look to examples where there have been international cooperation on environmental issues, right? Like, ozone depletion is like an example we talk about as a success. It was just so much more focused on specific technologies and specific regions. It was just easier to grasp, I think. Whereas with climate change, it really is just this tragedy of the commons, right? It's like a very a resource that everyone can use together, and hence needs to like solve together. And so, I would say one thing though, that we sort of like the response to many of these things is non-linear. Like, and I know this is not exactly what you're talking about, but when you look at like technology adoption curves, they call them an S curve, right? That like there's very low adoption of some technology at first, then it takes off, and then eventually it plateaus. And that's happening with solar adoption, wind adoption, and yet a lot of the ways in which we frame things are like as if they will be linear. Like, gosh, we didn't do enough last year to achieve it. And so maybe that's just me trying to make myself feel better, but that's I think that is important, that we, if we can reach, they talk about tipping points, right? There are climate tipping points where once we go so far, it's hard to come back. I think there's the same thing in terms of like responses, tipping points in terms of catalysts, in terms of technology adoption and policy responses. And so they're slow going in the beginning. We just need to reach that like kind of the tipping point where we catalyze things enough to where they then become their own reaction. And so we're not there yet with a lot of it, but I think it still can happen.
I think there's a question here.
So I try to frame my research in terms of intrinsic goods, namely well-being. And I think of climate as a necessary but not a sufficient condition for well-being. So sometimes I'm a little disturbed by the extreme focus on emissions. You improve whatever it is you're measuring. So, I mean, there are a lot of efforts, I think, to reduce emissions, but they increase the burden of other pollutants, especially having impacts on equality and ecological systems and political destabilization. So I'm wondering if you have a good sense of like some good examples or things that you're the most concerned about, or some like good people doing good work in regarding climate as a part of the problem and trying to avoid unintended consequences versus the worst offenders.
So maybe some of you might be familiar with voluntary carbon markets, which are basically ways in which companies have invested in like carbon offsets. Which in principle, when the idea came out, it was like, oh, I invest in some type of action. Like oftentimes they're nature-based solutions, like invest in forestry or some other kind of thing like that. That's not directly part of the company's value chain, but they want to have that be a reduction in their GHG emissions, like as part of their carbon accounting. Well, they've become controversial because it's really hard to demonstrate what we call additionality, that you really would have invested, like had that carbon reduction really happen if you hadn't invested in it, and I won't go too much into it. And so right now, there's not much activity, I'd say, from companies, at least, in investment in carbon offsets through that. But having said that, a lot of the companies we talk with have said they haven't given up on it entirely. They've just changed the paradigm a bit to like, maybe they're not going to use it to literally show up on their carbon balance sheet, but they are going to use it to signal, essentially, the priorities of their company. And coming back to your original question, they're really looking for co-benefits. meaning that they're not just going to invest in like forestry, you know, to maintain it. They're also looking, how can you demonstrate benefits to a community when you preserve a forest, or you stop the destruction of forests for agriculture. So I'd say that I do see being much more prevalent, not just investing in decarbonization, but decarbonization with co-benefits in terms of the people or the economy.
Yeah, maybe one note I'll add, I mentioned like benefit cost ratios. I think it's important kind of when you're looking at that full suite of benefits. Okay, now take out the carbon emissions piece. Like, how does it balance out now? I mean, I spent like the first part of my career more on the like local environmental concerns. I was like in waste regulation, local air pollution. So now everything is climate, climate policy. I'm like, this is important, but don't forget like the lessons we learned, that built that previous regulation.
Maybe
so we know that the United Nations organizes this global climate conference on a yearly basis, which is COP. But quite often the outcome of the conference is disappointing because countries are not making bold commitments or they are not putting their words into action. In the meanwhile, I think this kind of like global conference also generate a lot of carbon emission itself as well. So I'm just curious, to what extent do you think conferences like COP is pushing forward the global climate agenda nowadays? Or to say, do you think it's still super useful or relevant in nowadays world? Yeah, thank you.
I've never been. I don't know if either of you have been to a COP. Yeah, I know it's kind of people.
I've not been on the negotiating team, but I've been there to observe and kind of interact with other people. And I would say, I don't people say about democracy, it's a terrible system, but it's the best we've got. I kind of feel like it's a similar thing. I do think that bringing people together to interact and talk about these is much better than interacting online or, a lot of times the like key elements of these negotiations happen outside of the formal settings. The formal settings, I have observed them a little bit, and it's like watching paint dry, because there's so much procedure, but we need to do that, to be respectful and equitable. But so I would say it's still the best we got, and in terms of the carbon footprint of it is not negligible. One of my colleagues here at MIT named Greg Norris, he talks about approaches where we think about being both our footprints and our handprints. And the footprints are basically kind of like the impacts of everything we do in terms of the burdens. But if actions that you can take can reduce emissions elsewhere, then you can quantify that as your handprint. And if your handprint's bigger than your footprint, then you're net positive. And so that like, anytime that I'm flying or, traveling, that's what I really think about. It's like, what's the potential of this action that I'm going to take leads to larger systemic changes that will increase my handprint. And so I do think it's important to take that seriously, and that's why I would continue to have them. But you're right, it's not great, but I do think it's better than nothing.
Yeah. So, what are you seeing in terms of the venture capital, this AI, sucking all the money, and then, of course, Trump administration not putting a lot of pressure. So what are you seeing in the last 1 or 2 years on the VC side of funding for climate and, sustainability initiatives? Anything you can comment? Thank you.
VC funding for climate, sounds like you.
Yeah, I really focus on public markets, so I don't know that much about venture capital. Sorry.
I mean, I guess the only thing I can maybe chime in, we've talked kind of about the federal tax credits. Okay, a lot of them are changing. So I think a lot of companies are having to recalculate. Either they're going to go under or they're going to survive. They're going to stay if it makes economic sense, and if not, they're out. I mean, so Like I look at big companies like Fervo, they still have the geothermal tax credits are strong. Like that company I think is getting a lot of investment. So I think there's going to be some big winners, and yeah, but maybe that's like a lot of this venture capital
Yeah.
world.
Yeah. I mean, I think the momentum is not as high as it was a couple of years ago, but it's definitely still there. I think what you hear is like just maybe changes in the way the companies are talking about what they're doing. You know, maybe instead of decarbonization, it's about like resource availability, right? Or, you know, making your supply chains more efficient or resilient, when really there's also a climate benefit as well. So I think there's kind of a pivot in the way the companies are talking about it. But yeah, there definitely still are VC investments. We still get, like, companies will have, like, many of our member companies have their own venture operations that invest in companies that are focused on decarbonization, because they want that investment to pay off in reducing the company's own greenhouse gas emissions. So it's definitely there, but I think the framing has changed.
I think we have time for one more question, if anyone.
You know, right there. Okay. we can do it too.
Thank you for the second question. So my question is about energy efficiency of AI versus human workers. Of course, we've seen a massive move towards AI-based workforce. We can think of customer service, bots of other domains as well. Are any of the companies that you're working with looking at that through the energy lens rather than the pure cost lens? I want to hear yes.
Maybe I need a clarification. Do you mean, are they looking at it as a way to reduce energy consumption associated with human workers by replacing them with AI, or?
I think we'll find that some tasks are more energy efficient when executed by humans versus AI. But I don't know of anyone in my sector of life science healthcare who's doing that type of math.
Yeah.
But the human is going to eat lunch, commute to work, maybe some other things.
Yeah.
That's already a baked-in cost. We're already doing that today. AI is an add-in cost. I don't see corporation in my sector looking at that transition in the workforce with any regard to energy emissions, any of that. They're only looking at how much cheaper it is to have an AI agent versus somebody they have to pay benefits for and so on.
Yeah, I also haven't seen like an energy comparison of the two, like essentially a life cycle assessment comparing both of those. So yeah, I get what you're saying. It is interesting. I just haven't seen it myself. But. Okay.
Yeah, nothing like that. I think most companies, it's kind of been like, here's another tool. You know how you learned how to use all the Microsoft Office tools. Like, here's another thing, kind of an add-on. But yeah.
Yeah, I would say definitely haven't done. They're definitely not doing that kind of analysis at my firm. But definitely looking at ways that AI can execute tasks that just wouldn't be possible with humans alone. For example, like I mentioned before, that we try to get a sense of companies' resilience efforts, their internal resilience activities, and also how relevant their products and services are for their customers or clients to build resilience. So, you know, companies in the construction and green infrastructure, water solutions, agricultural solutions, et cetera, like the very broadly defined adaptation space. It wouldn't be possible to analyze every, earnings call transcript from every company and score it and, develop an investment signal from that with me and an analyst or something. So we're using, GPT tools to do things like that in the adaptation space. And another thing that we're really excited about is the way that AI is being used in weather and climate modeling, like this sort of huge, period of growth in weather and climate modeling. That's really exciting, that is improving forecasts in the short term, operational forecasts, and also improving, for example, precipitation simulations on decadal timescales, reducing error. So these are all, things that are really, really useful in terms of AI. But yeah, that's an interesting point that you raised.
I think just one last thing is I think part of the challenge is that it's not that often, at least that I've observed, where you have like a one-to-one replacement of here's something a human did and now here's an AI bot doing it, right? Like a lot of times it's usually an AI is improving something or it's changing the way you do your job. So I imagine that kind of makes it hard to do like a comparison.
Well, with that, if we could have a round of applause for, sorry. Yeah.
Thank you.
I just want to say we have some refreshments in the back, so please help yourself after this. But before we get to those, I just want to say a big thank you to CS3 for helping put this IAP course on. Thank you to the rest of the instructional team for giving some really great lectures on climate science and the fundamentals of climate policy. I also want to give a big shout out to Dimonika, who none of this would have been possible without her logistical help, so thank you. Thank you to MIT Audio and Visual for providing sound and for recording these lectures so that people can see them going forward. And then, finally, thank you to our panelists for coming and giving their perspectives on these really important topics. And, thank you all for coming and joining us. The class would not have been anything without you all being here, so thank you.